Honda RA302 1960s. Imagine you're a Formula One driver in 1968, and your team's engineers walk up to you with a shiny new car. Great, you think, until they mention it's made of magnesium, not magnesium components. The entire monocoque chassis is basically a giant piece of flammable metal that burns hotter than the surface of the sun. Now, we can't call this just poor engineering. We'd argue that the Honda RA302 was a corporate-sponsored murder, dressed up as innovation. Honda's executives, drunk on their own technological arrogance, decided that making their car lighter was worth turning their drivers into potential human torches. The RA302's magnesium construction meant that any significant impact would create a fire so intense that conventional extinguishing methods were completely useless. Water would make it worse. Foam was pointless. And sand just provided a nice base for the inferno to sit on. John Surtees, Honda's lead driver and a man who'd literally won championships on 2 wheels and 4, took one look at this rolling crematorium and said, "Absolutely not." This is a guy who'd survived crashes that would have killed lesser mortals, but even he recognized a death sentence when he saw one. Surtees actively campaigned against it, calling it a potential death trap to anyone who would listen. However, Honda's response was breathtakingly callous. "Don't worry about it, we'll find someone else." They treated Surtees' legitimate safety concerns like he was being dramatic. Joe Schlesser, a talented but desperate driver who probably needed the paycheck more, ended up behind the wheel. At the French Grand Prix, the inevitable happened. 2 laps in, crash, and suddenly there was a magnesium fire so monumentally intense that the marshals couldn't get within 50 feet of it. Schlesser died in agony while Honda executives watched their innovation burn, completely unable to help because their brilliant lightweight chassis had become an inextinguishable funeral pyre. The RA302 never raced again, obviously, but the damage to Honda's reputation was permanent and deserved. The hatred for this car goes further than normal motorsport criticism, because when your own world champion tells you something will kill people, and you ignore him for the sake of engineering ego, you've crossed into genuinely evil territory that no amount of technical innovation can excuse. Life F190 1980s. The Life F190 achieved something truly special in 1989. It made Formula One look like a complete joke. This Life F190 was a rolling embarrassment that regularly got outpaced by Formula 3 cars at the same events. Yes, Junior Series cars were posting faster lap times than this supposed pinnacle of motorsport machine. The W12 engine was life's masterstroke of incompetence. 12 cylinders sounds impressive until you realize it produced less power than most road cars, while making the kind of mechanical noises that suggested imminent catastrophic failure. The Life L190 sounded like a cement mixer having an existential crisis, and performed about as well as one, too. But where the hatred really builds is that they kept showing up. Weekend after weekend, Life would roll into the paddock with their mobile disaster, completely oblivious to the fact that they were making the entire sport look ridiculous. Mechanics spent more time with their heads buried under the hood, trying to coax the engine into running than actually watching it go around the track. The qualifying sessions were pure comedy gold for everyone except Life. They would send their drivers out. The timing screens would light up with lap times that made seasoned journalists do double takes. And then the inevitable happened. They didn't qualify. Not once. Not a single race all season. They missed every qualifying cutoff by margins so vast that other teams probably thought there was a glitch in the timing system. Gary Brabham and Bruno Giacomelli, the unfortunate souls tasked with piloting this catastrophe, became involuntary comedians every time they climbed into the cockpit. These were legitimate racing drivers being humiliated on a weekly basis by this car so fundamentally broken that it turned professional motorsport into slapstick comedy. Lola T9730, 1990s. The Lola T9730 represents corporate stupidity at its absolute finest. A masterclass in how to destroy a racing team's reputation in exactly one weekend. MasterCard had already spent millions on marketing campaigns, promising they'd be sponsoring an F1 team in 1997. And when reality caught up with their PowerPoint presentations, they panicked. Hard. Lola had been sensibly developing a proper F1 car for the 1998 season, taking their time to get everything right. Then, MasterCard burst through their doors, demanding a car immediately, because admitting their marketing department had jumped the gun wasn't an option. So Lola, probably while consuming industrial quantities of coffee, and muttering increasingly creative profanities, threw together what was essentially a very expensive prototype with some official F1 stickers. The T9730 wasn't a race car. It was more of a science experiment that someone forgot to finish. Every component screamed rush job, from the hastily designed aerodynamics to the barely functional systems that held the thing together. This was what happened when corporate pressure met engineering reality, and engineering reality got its face smashed in. The Australian Grand Prix debut was spectacular in all the wrong ways. Both drivers didn't just miss the qualifying cut, they missed it by 11 seconds. In Formula One terms, that's like showing up to a knife fight with a pencil. Other teams were staring at the timing screens in disbelief, because surely no actual F1 car could be that catastrophically hopeless. But the crazy part is, after this nuclear-level humiliation, the team literally packed up and disappeared forever. One race weekend, total failure, goodbye cruel world. They became motorsport's greatest one-hit wonder. Except, instead of a hit, it was more like showing up to the Met Gala wearing a garbage bag and wondering why nobody wanted photos. McLaren MP418 2000s. The McLaren MP418 is the story of F1's greatest what-if, turning into its most spectacular oh no. In 2003, fresh off championship glory, McLaren announced they were building something so revolutionary, it'll make everyone else look like they're driving horse-drawn carriages. The MP418 was supposed to be their masterpiece, so advanced, so perfect, that it would redefine what an F1 car could be. Instead, it became the automotive equivalent of that friend who promises they're almost ready, and then shows up 3 hours late, covered in mysterious stains. The car was so tightly packaged and radically designed that it basically became a four-wheeled anxiety attack. Every test session was like playing a dangerous game. Would it overheat? Would it crash? Would it spontaneously decide that physics was more of a suggestion than a law? McLaren's own mechanics started calling it a suicide contraption, which is not exactly the nickname you want for your cutting-edge race car. And the beautiful irony is, McLaren spent so much time making it revolutionary that they forgot to make it work. The MP418 couldn't complete a proper test session without something catastrophically failing. Cooling systems gave up, electronics had nervous breakdowns, and the car handled like it was actively trying to kill whoever was brave enough to drive it. After months of throwing money and engineering hours at this rolling disaster, McLaren gave up entirely. They shelved the MP418 and started over with a completely different car. McLaren MP430 2010s. The McLaren MP430 was supposed to be Formula One's greatest comeback story. McLaren and Honda, the legendary partnership that had dominated the late 80s and early 90s with Senna and Prost, were reuniting for what everyone assumed would be an immediate return to glory. The hype was insane, the expectations were through the roof, and the reality turned out to be a complete and utter catastrophe. But Honda's 2015 power unit wasn't just bad, it was aggressively, almost vindictively terrible. It produced less power than a decent road car while consuming fuel like a small aircraft and breaking down with the regularity of a cheap alarm clock. It sounded like a dying vacuum cleaner and went about as fast as one too, turning every race weekend into a public humiliation ritual for two of motorsport's most prestigious brands. Fernando Alonso was reduced to making radio calls that sounded like therapy sessions. His frustration could be touched, his disappointment crushing, and his barely concealed fury at Honda's incompetence became must-see television for all the wrong reasons. Jenson Button, normally the most diplomatically polite driver on the grid, started giving interviews that could barely conceal his existential crisis. Here was a world champion in the twilight of his career, expecting to go out on a high with the revived McLaren Honda Dream Team, instead finding himself trapped in a rolling advertisement for how not to build a Formula One power unit. The Honda engine actively seemed to hate the concept of forward motion. Reliability was non-existent, fuel consumption was laughable, and the performance deficit was so enormous that McLaren drivers spent entire races being lapped by cars they dominated just years earlier. Alpine A521, A522, a 523, 2020s. Fernando Alonso didn't return to Formula One after 2 years away to drive a therapist's couch on wheels, but that's exactly what Alpine gave him. These recent Alpine cars have turned two-time world champions into amateur psychologists, desperately trying to figure out what what their car is feeling from one corner to the next. The A521, A522, and A523 are not just slow or unreliable. They're fundamentally broken at the most basic level of what a racing car should do. One moment they understeer like a shopping trolley with a stuck wheel. The next they snap into oversteer like they've suddenly developed a death wish. There's no consistency, no predictability, just pure automotive chaos. Esteban Ocon has spent 3 seasons looking like he's trying to defuse a bomb while doing complex mathematics. The poor guy never knows if his car will cooperate through a corner sequence or decide to spontaneously attempt murder. The real tragedy is what these cars represent for modern Formula One. They're symptoms of a disease that's infected the entire sport. Cars so heavy, so electronically complicated, and so fundamentally numb that they've stripped away everything that made F1 special. Lewis Hamilton's brutal assessment that these cars are awful to drive wasn't just criticism of Alpine specifically, it was a total condemnation of what Formula One has become. When 7-time world champions are publicly complaining that modern F1 cars have lost their soul, you know something has gone catastrophically wrong. Alpine's cars have become the perfect symbol of Formula One's descent from pure driving artistry into computerized mediocrity. They've helped transform the world's greatest drivers from artists into frustrated technicians, managing systems instead of mastering machines. Katerham CT05 2014. The 2014 rule changes were meant to make Formula One safer by forcing teams to use lower noses. But nobody warned the FIA that teams would respond by creating some of the ugliest machines in racing history. Caterham took this design challenge and somehow made it much worse, building the CT05, a car so horribly ugly that it became famous on the internet for all the wrong reasons. The CT05's weird nose design looked like someone had taken a normal F1 car and stuck a bizarre tube on the front that made no sense at all. This was not just a small design mistake, but a complete visual disaster that made people stare in shock and wonder if Caterham's designers had ever actually seen a race car before they started working. The car's front end had a gross bulge sticking out that seemed to get more disgusting the longer you looked at it. Caterham had inadequate funds to invest in quality design, so they painted the front black in an attempt to hide the unfinished portions of what looked like something from a bad science fiction movie. Their genius solution to making something that looked terrible was trying to hide it with black paint, like closing your eyes and hoping a problem goes away. But people hated the CT05 for more than just how awful it looked. This was Caterham's final moment before dying, the last sad attempt by a team that had spent years being the slowest and most useless cars on the track. They were already a joke that everyone laughed at, always finishing last and never giving fans anything exciting to watch, except serving as slow obstacles for the real racing cars. Marcus Ericsson and Kamui Kobayashi had to get into this embarrassing car every weekend, knowing that millions of people watching around the world were pointing and laughing at their car before it even started moving. The CT05 was certainly one of the ugliest cars ever to race in Formula One, which is really saying something in a sport that's built plenty of ugly cars over the years. The CT05 shows what happens when Formula One's hunt for better airflow creates something so ugly that nobody cares how fast it goes, proving that sometimes trying to bend the rules makes monsters that belong in a museum of design failures rather than on a racetrack. The car was slow, unreliable, and looked like a mistake that should never have been built, making it the perfect symbol of a team that had completely lost its way.